A warm welcome to this refresher guide to the Operational Combat series, where today we're going to be looking at combat itself, the pinnacle of the entire game. This is designed for people who kind of semi-remember the rules, maybe have taken a break from OCS to play some other things and need a refresher. If you don't know anything, then you may well want to go and have a look at OCS World YouTube channel, where Ari reads the rules, all of them, and cross-references them and gives examples of what that means. And I found it very useful as a way of confirming that I was getting what I was saying here to be correct. I think we also sadly need to acknowledge the passing of Dean Essig. It's difficult now to remember all the way back to 1992 when the first OCS game, Guderian's Blitzkrieg, was released. What a bombshell it was. At that time, to be frank, a lot of games were very, very samey, similar combat results tables, very similar zone of control kinds of rules. Dean came along, reimagined what an operational game could be, and here we are in 2024, still talking about it, exciting new games still being released. So, what a legacy. Thank you, Dean. What is regular combat? Well, it's just one of the many ways in which you can attack your enemy. You, in movement phase, can overrun and do hip shots against your enemy. You can do barrages in various barrage segments in your enemy. But I would argue that the combat, which occurs in the combat segments, is the pinnacle. It's the big boy. It's the this is really going to shift things kind of attack. It depends what kind of army, particularly in terms of its quality as represented by its action rating, how you're going to do this. So if you have an elite army against a poor quality army, typically in the earlier war, you're likely to get an action rating differential of +3 or +4, one of your 5 action rating units coming along and trying to bully a 1 action rating unit. In that case, you can play in 2 different styles. Firstly, you can use a small fort, or indeed even a single unit, and attack pretty secure in the knowledge that you're going to get an attacker surprise and a number of column shifts along the combat results table. And then on that column, you're going to get a dice roll modifier to push you down to the lower results where the juicy defender losses are. Now, if you do that, you'll get in a lot of attacks, but some of them are likely to fail, occasionally a little bit painfully. Or you can go in with a big force and avoid any risk of a bad result, or an AO1, which is a sort of bounce back, nothing result. You're also more likely to gain exploitation, allowing those forces to go again in the exploitation phase with another attack, and you're likely to cause the defender more serious losses and bigger retreats. If your armies are equal, typified by the later war, you'll struggle to get a +1 or a +2 action rating. Imagine you get a +2 action rating in combat, you've only got a 42% chance of attacker surprise. I mean, that's pretty good. But there's a 50% chance of no surprise at all, that you'll just have to fight with the odds that you've got to hand. And by the iron grip of mathematics, there's an 8% chance that you'll get defender surprise. I mean, obviously, if you're in an attack focus, that's like almost impossible, but trust me, it does happen. So you kind of have to expect you're going to get a lot of AO1 results where you usually will bounce and retreat 1 hex, but occasionally you are going to have to take that as a loss in order to force your defender to take theirs either as a retreat, opening up their front line, or as a painful unit loss. If you're a poor quality army versus an elite one, then you'd be lucky, frankly, to get a 0 differential in the action rating, and you're probably going to be operating at a minus. So you always have to expect that you're going to take an AL1. Obviously, these attacks aren't hugely popular, Sometimes you're forced to by game-specific rules. Thank you very much, Stalin, and you're counterattacking in Smolensk. You may even lose big if it all goes very, very wrong. But your hope is sometimes you'll get a DO1 result, which will again force a difficult choice on your elite enemy. It's also possible that if you are thick with supply and your elite enemy are on a shoestring, then you will exhaust or at least degrade their supply. And possibly, if you can destroy a unit, you will also degrade their replacements. Now, attacks are always a lot more expensive than supply, but that certainly can happen. To do a combat, in the rules, there's just a handy 9-step little process. This is just an illustration of it. So first of all, the attacker selects their hex or hexes from which they're attacking from and selects the hex they're going to attack to. The attacker has to pay combat supplies, but the defender has a choice. They may withhold. That does cause the combat strength to halve, but if the defender thinks they're going to lose anyhow, why waste good supply on a bad defense? Thirdly, each side announces which unit is going to be the lead, and they use their action ratings in the following combat. The attacker first. Then the defender, and it's important to note how much choice the defender gets in a combat, gets to choose the defensive terrain that's going to be fought over. So first of all, they choose the terrain in the hex that they're in, the hex that's been attacked, and that will give you the category, open, close, very close, etc. Obviously, if you're just, say, in an open hex, there's no choice, but look at this hex. There's rough, there's hills, there's light woods. Secondly, the defender gets to choose either the attacker has to attack the terrain in the hex they're in, that they've just decided, or if there's hex side terrain and the attacker has to cross it, then they can use that. So there's a minor river here on 3 sides. Any defender is going to say, yes, please, go across that minor river. So that's going to halve the defender's combat strength. Then you calculate the dice roll modifier using the action rating and any adjustments because of mode, typically -1 for disorganized, and whether there's a hedgehog present to roll for surprise. Use 2 d6s, adjust with the DRM, and then you'll be given how many shifts for the attacker surprise to the right or how many to the left for the defender surprise. You then roll for combat, again 2d6, again adjusted by the action rating dice roll modifier, any modes, and then the hedgehog level. So if you've, say, got a level 3 hedgehog, then it's adjusted by 3. You then execute the combat results, the attacker first, starting with their lead unit that contributed the action rating, and then you advance after combat, assuming the defender has had the good grace to either retreat or be completely eliminated from the hex. That's sort of how you do it, and if you do that a few times, it becomes second nature. But I would argue that actually, because combat is a peak pinnacle in the game turn, it's much more important to view combat in the context of the game turn. So here we have the movement phase, here we have your opponent's reaction phase, here we have the combat phase, and at the end I've just tacked on the exploitation. In reality, the exploitation is all of this all over again, except there's no reaction in the exploitation phase. So the first thing you've got to do at the beginning of your movement phase is ask yourself, where am I going to attack? If you're playing Fog of War, and I can't recommend too strongly that you should, this is quite problematic. You've only got your prior battle experience really to go on, and your watching of enemy movements a bit, and if it's the first game turn, then obviously you've got the scenario listings, but the second, the third, that soon starts to become less relevant. I recommend that you play Fog of War, because if you don't, you give your opponent a huge example because they can perfectly play the exact combat strength needed to get the exact odds that they want for this combat. No wastage. If you play Fog of War, there's doubt. And where there's doubt, you have to err on the side of caution and add more combat strength to your attack. Combat strength that, if you knew exactly how many to contribute, could be used for something else. Having decided where you're going to attack, you then have to decide, am I going to reinforce? Do I anticipate that my opponent is going to do anything to reinforce the hex I want to attack, and therefore do I have to reinforce that first? I could reinforce for action rating, for improving the quality of the attack. I could reinforce for combat strength, trying to push up the odds on the CTR, or I could do both. Having done that, I could decide whether to disorganize my target hex using air barrage. That also could be done by hip shots during the movement segment itself, as opposed to the barrage segment in the movement phase, which is just for air and indeed naval. If you do that, then it's comparatively cheap, but it does telegraph where you're thinking of attacking. Your opponent, in their reaction, has all the fun of trying to spoil your attack. They may wonder where they can counter barrage your likely attacking hexes using either hip shoots if they have them, or air barrage if they don't, or any artillery that's in reserve. All of that contributes to a whole kind of, I don't want to say shell game, but there's an air war game within all of this. And it's entirely possible that you say to yourself at the beginning of the turn, you know what? I don't have sufficient air superiority this term. I'm going to prioritize fighter sweeps and attacks on air bases to try and gain air superiority in order to do a proper, more successful combat next turn. The defender can then attempt to reinforce where they think the attack is going to be. And again, that could be for action rating to improve the quality, or it could be combat strength. Then it passes back to you as the attacker, and you can think about if and where you want to do artillery barrages. Now, they are comparatively expensive, but if the hex you want to attack has been reinforced, well, it would negate that. And it's also possible that it might hide your attack location, and that could be in a couple of ways. It could be that you just don't do an air barrage. So before the reaction phase, you just haven't disorganized anything to try and keep your hex from the attacker. Or it could be that you've used your air barrage as a feint. You've telegraphed that you're going to attack this hex, and then you come in with your artillery and attack a completely different hex. Along with Fog of War, this kind of mind game is just such a joy, / possibly a little bit life-shortening. It's also true that in barrages, you have a greater chance of step loss, but that's usually a bonus unless you go way up into the high reaches of super expensive barrages. You then both need to do your combat supply and pick your lead units, and as we've discussed, the defender tries to choose the optimal defending terrain. You then roll for combat surprise. Now, there's a little side panel in the rules that tries to encourage you not to get too upset at the surprise, particularly negative defender surprise, because, -6 defender surprise is never nice for anybody, but actually the combat results table is comparatively flat. So getting what sounds like a big adjustment might actually be only a slightly worse or better combat result. The combat attack roll, you don't need to look at the stack if you're playing Fog of War. Try and remember that. I may have forgotten that on occasion, because all you really need is the action rating differential. You need to know if there's any anti-tank effects in open terrain, and you need to know the modified strength, making sure that people have modified it by disorganized modes and terrain and defender supply, that kind of thing. That way, you preserve your fog of war for the future. The attacker then applies any losses that they have to take. If they get an optional, they can take that as retreat, and if they do, that is sort of the end of the attack, because the defender doesn't have to do its optionals if the attacker hasn't done theirs, has just retreated instead. However, the defender can always take its optional. So imagine you get attacked in open terrain, it becomes an AO1, DO1 result, the attacker retreats. You don't have to, as a defender, take your retreat, but you could move one hex into more defendable terrain and thank your attacker for a free movement. You do the retreats and advantages, and then any units that you have in exploitation result from combat, and any units that you have remaining in reserve can rinse and repeat the whole thing, as I said, without the enemy being able to do very much about it. Sneaky. I mean, if you want to go to the nth degree of deception, you could just set up some feint attacks in your combat phase and then unleash in exploitation your real offensive. Sneaky. That's the theory. I mean, we love a bit of theory, but let's work this through in detail using an example from OCS Crimea, a lovely game which also adds on to Third Winter and Case Blue. Here we are in the Cross of Iron scenario. We're at turn 1, and let's imagine that the Soviets are planning. They've gained either the initiative or it's their turn. Here they are on their front line, and they are wondering, where are we going to attack? Well, I would suggest that this is an interesting hex for your attack. It is both the hinge, or if you prefer, elbow of the Axis front line. If you were able to force the Axis out of this hex, it would not destroy, but certainly weaken this front line. And it has this 457 assault gun battalion, one of only 2 5-factor action rating units that the Axis have in the Kuban. And if you were able to destroy that, well, that would be a good day at the Soviet office. Having decided where to attack, you decide how to reinforce. Now, the Axis have this 457, the Soviets have this 848, but there's only one. So it would be a comparatively straightforward thing for the Axis player to disorganize that, making this 4 into a 3 action rating through disorganization. So to make things a little bit more complicated, you could move this 445 tank brigade to this hex and force the Axis to disorganize 2 hexes rather than 1. And I think that's a minimum reinforcement. You could also increase the combat strength here. Underneath this 445, there's a 7 strength armored unit, and underneath this assault gun battalion, there's also another armored unit. And over here, there are 3 tank battalions. The tank battalions can't get to this hex in their combat mode, so they'd have to flip to move mode, but they would add a few more points, which might be decisive in taking it to the next level, depending on what you assess the strength to be. Now it's the first turn, you know exactly what the strength is, but the downside, of course, in increasing the combat strength is that that will consume an awful lot more of combat supply, and although the Soviets are pretty good for supply, it's never infinite. Next question is, do we bring along the Soviet Air Force to try and DG this hex? It will telegraph that this is the likely attack hex, but then, it sort of is anyhow. However, it is in the patrol zone of a couple of Focke-Wulfs on a couple of air bases on the Kerch Peninsula. So that would make the flak worse and obviously make these susceptible to interception. So rather than sending them in alone, you might want to escort them. The Soviets have a fantastic Spitfire 5, which is every bit as good as the Focke-Wulf, and it has a Yak, which is only slightly not as good. So they could mix it up in the air, but who knows how that would go. And so as a Soviet, I may want to try and deal with the air situation first before I mount this attack. But let's press on. If we attack with these two illusions, we'll be on the 12 to 16 column. We get a 1 shift to the right because there are 5 REs in this hex. We get another one to the right because these planes are operating from an airbase within 10 hexes. And we get a 1 to the left because they are defending in a hedgehog. So that gives us the 17 to 24 column, an 83% chance of a DG, which, is pretty formidable. Obviously, it's nearly a 1 in 5 chance of failure, but, that's still pretty good odds. 17% chance of a step loss, so, that's just, a cherry on top. The Axis have to think about how they want to spoil this. Now, I decided not to put this flamethrower tank battalion with its 5 action rating into reserve, but if I had, I could wheel this down and reinforce this hex if the Soviet Air Force had DG'd it. You notice the slightly wonky movement here. This is because of the good old ABBA rule. If you can't move from A to B, then you can't move from B to A. So although this hex is in the clear, an armoured unit can't move into this hex because it's in a swamp. So the tanks have to come down the railway line, carry on in the railway line to this open hex, and then move across. However, I didn't put it in reserve. So instead, I'm thinking about using the Air Force here. So here I have a little team of a Focke-Wulf and a Junkers, which together could be a very tiny little hip shot group. I have 2 sets of them, so they could attack Hex A and Hex B. Now, again, they are within the patrol zone of Soviet air defenses, so more flak and again, more possible interception, but let's leave that to one side. They could attack Hex A on 17 to 24, shifted to the right twice, once because they're within 10 of their air bases, and once because in Hex A there's 3.5 REs. That gives them a 97% chance of disorganizing and a cherry on top 18% chance of a step loss. So basically pretty certain. You're probably allowed to use bad language or something if you miss a 97% chance. Hex B is ironically exactly the same. You get 3 shifts because there are 5 REs in this hex, but 1 less because of the terrain. You also have the option of reserve artillery, which in the unlikely event that these hip shots failed, could take up the slack. Or there are also a Romanian bomber and fighter, which could come in the reactions barrage segment and it's a little bit of a Hail Mary, but they could have a pop as well and see if they can't get the all-important DG. If you use the artillery, they are only on 8 to 11, shifted 1 to the right for REs in Hex A. So that's just a 72% chance of disorganized and a 15% chance of a step loss. And in Hex B, it's the same. They're moved 2 to the right because of the greater number of REs, but 1 to the left for the terrain. In terms of supply, using the air is so much better because barrage is free. You only have to refit the air bases, and they're stationed on 2. For the artillery, it would cost 4T, a whole supply point, which is a lot, actually, for the Germans. So you can see there's a lot to think about. And then it comes back to the Soviet and the actual combat phase. And the first thing they have to think about is, well, do we barrage now? They have 2 artillery units, this 32-2 and 31-2, 2 artillery brigades. So a strength of either 30 if you use 1 or 60 if you combine them. They get shifted 1 to the right because there's 3.5 REs here, and 1 to the left because it's hedgehog. So if you go in with the 30, it'll cost you 4 tokens, an entire supply point. But it'll give you, a pretty good 92% chance of disorganizing and a bonus 1 in 5 chance of a step loss. If you go all in and use both, it's going to cost you 6 tokens of supply, but it's going to bring you up to that 97% chance of DG, the same as the Axis hip shots. and a 33% chance of a step loss, which is, would be nice. Note that in Crimea's game-specific rules, if this was an earlier scenario, these two artilleries couldn't fire together. They would need to be stacked together, but this is a later scenario, so this is not true. If we roll, and all of my rolls on 2 dice are going to be 7 for this example, and all my rolls on 1 dice are going to be 3. So if we roll a 7 at 30, that will disorganize it, but there won't be a step loss. And if we commit the whole 60, that will be a disorganized and a 50-50 chance of step loss. So lots of choices for the Soviet player. Is it worth it? Once you've done the air and the artillery, it depends how much is disorganized. If you miss disorganizing the Axis, for example, probably not worth attacking. If the Axis managed to miss disorganizing one of yours, I focused on these two because this is where the action rating is. But those Romanians could have come in on this hex here, or indeed the artillery could have fired on this hex here and disorganized them as well. Let's prepare for battle. We will assume that the Axis is disorganized and these two hexes are disorganized. First of all, we pay supply because we never forget to pay combat supply because we never get too excited and want to rush to throwing the dice. The Axis will have to pay 2T, which is fine. But if they've had to pay 4T for the artillery, then actually they're paying a supply point and a half, which is quite a lot for them. The Russians get to pay 2T for this division, 5 for this stack, and 4 for this stack. In reality, I probably wouldn't use this battalion. It only has a strength of 2. If it's being disorganized, that's halved, and if it's crossing the river, that's halved again. 2 for the Axis, 11 in this example, probably only 10 really. The AI units are 5 -1, and one of these two 4s -1. The terrain is this hex and this hex. They are going to both have to attack across the minor river, which is going to halve them again. This hex is in the open, so that's unaffected, and the defense is in open terrain as well, so it's going to be on that column in the results table. The calculation, obviously, is 5 and 4, both -1 for disorganized, so a net -1, not forgetting the hedgehogs, which will come into play. For the calculations, surprise, well, oddly enough, we're going to roll a 7. We're at -2, 1 for the action rating, 1 for the hedgehog, and that would give us defender surprise. If we rolled a 7, that would take us to a 5. That 5, if we roll 1 for surprise, gives us a 3, which would give us 3 to the left, which is suboptimal for the Soviet player. For combat, we are going to again have the -2 DRM, 1 for the action rating, and 1 for the level 1 hedgehog in this case. And we're going to add in that 3 shifts to the left for defender surprise in the open. The strength is going to be 12 for this unit if Axis attempts to disorganize it failed, or if they just didn't try. It's going to be 6 1/4 for this hex. I should point out that I and my friends use optional rule 21.2 for proportional losses. There are other systems that I will cover shortly. This 12 is halved to 6 because it's disorganized, and halved again because it's crossing a river for 3. This one is 13, but it's at 2/3 strength, which is 8.666666, which gets rounded to 9, which is then halved to 4.5 and halved to 2 1/4. And this is a 4 that becomes a 2, becomes a 1, hence 6 1/4. Likewise, this one is 5.5. You can see this unit gets halved all the way down to 0.5, which is probably neither here nor there, and I wouldn't use it. The Axis, they have this 16 strength division, but they've lost a step, so that becomes 12, which becomes 6, while this 4 becomes a 2. So they are at 8. Which gives us an odds of 23.75 to 8. which is 2.96 to 1, which is rounded to 3 to 1. But then it's shifted, because of the defender's surprise, all the way down to 1 to 2. And if I roll a 7 at 1 to 2 and subtract 2 for the action rating to get a 5, the result is an AL1-01 for the Soviets and no result for the Axis. And the Axis crows quietly and maybe have a little sip of beer to celebrate. But it all could have been very different. If, say, hex 17 here hadn't been DG'd, then instead of 3 to 1, we'd have been at 4 to 1, which had been adjusted to 1 to 1, which would have had the same results for the Soviets at AL1-01, but would have given us a precious DO1 for the Axis, forcing either the Axis to retreat or to lose the lead unit, which actually is not a choice, because if the Axis tried to retreat from this hex, they could retreat up here, but it's retreating through a zone of control and it would lead the lead unit, and they could retreat down to here, ditto, they would lose the lead unit in a zone of control. So really, their only viable retreat option is to go here where this reserve mark is, but that's a swamp. And this tank unit cannot enter a swamp. It would have to be lost. Either entering a swamp, no, or into a zone of control. Actually, this hex is a swamp as well. So really, it could only retreat here and then be lost. So it's lost anyhow. And then the Soviet player would crow quietly and maybe have a sip of beer. That is the way of OCS. Now, I mentioned the proportional loss system. There are 3 different ways where you can calculate the strength of a multi-step division. So multi-step divisions are primarily infantry divisions, and they can have 2, 3, 4 steps in the division. Rule 911D, effects of losses, is the rule as written, the raw. And it says that if 1 or more steps are lost, the attack is halved. So say you've got a 4-strength German infantry division, and you lose 1 step, its attack is halved, which is painful. You know, if it was 20 strength points, suddenly it's now 10 strength points in attack just after losing 1. It's still 20 in defense. If you lose half or more steps, then the defense is halved. Now, I think this is problematic for 3 reasons, the least important of which is that this can have a lot of mental maths, because you have to keep the fractions and then add all the units with all the fractions until you get the combined total. And only at that point, in fact, and calculate the odds, and only at that point do you apply the rounding. More importantly, it makes the attack really brittle. 1 step lost, halved attack. Basically ruined in terms of an attacking roll. But worst of all, there are something like 3 different abuses that take place because of this rule. I'll cover them in a moment when I go through a worked example. The second system, you can replace the raw with optional rule 21.2, which is what I and my friends do. And this is a proportional loss system, which is really pretty simple. You take the printed strength, you multiply it by the current number of steps that are left in the division, you divide that by the number of steps the division originally had, and then you round it, and you apply it to the attack and to the defense equally. I think this makes the maths a lot simpler. It makes the strength loss much more gradual, and I think it removes these 3 abuses. Thirdly, there is House Rule 6, which is basically exactly the same as a raw, except that when your division is down to the very last step, it's quartered rather than halved in attack. However, it doesn't really impact on the attack being very brittle, and it doesn't impact the abuses or indeed the mental maths. Okay, let's have a look at an example of this. Here's one of these precious 1333 3-step rifle divisions. If you're the Soviet player, this is one of the best that you can get. And here is a 333 breakdown regiment that one of these divisions can generate. Here we have the three different rule systems: raw, proportional, house rule 6. And here we have this division in a variety of different steps. So if the division has all three steps, it's all the same. Attack in red, green in defense is 13 for everybody. Fine. If you spin out a breakdown regiment from this division, the attack becomes 9.5. That's because the division has lost a step. So in the rules as written, it's now halved in attack from 13 to 6.5. And then you add the 3 for the breakdown regiment to get 9.5. But defense with one step lost or a breakdown regiment removed is still at full strength. So you still get all 13 and you get 3 for the breakdown regiment to create 16 magical defense points. Now, Dean did try and mitigate this by making it that if the regiment was stacked with a division that could absorb it, that had a step loss and the same quality and stuff, then it would be absorbed. So you can't stack the breakdown regiment with the division and get this magical extra 3 points, but you can put it on another hex. Seems weird. So that's, if you like, the first abuse, and it's also true in the house rule. But in the proportional system, you get a tiny reduction. That's because with a breakdown regiment removed, the strength of this goes from 13 in the division to 8.66666, which is rounded to 9. 9 plus the 3 gives you 12. This seems reasonable. You get more operational flexibility for a slight decrease in strength. If you spin out 2 breakdown regiments from this division and only have 1 step remaining in the core division, in the rules as written, the attack now goes to 12.5. That's because the attack is halved to 6.5, and now you've got 2 breakdown regiments contributing 6 more to 12.5, which is also the same for the defense now. In the proportional, you're at 10. That's because this division is now having a strength of 4.33, which is rounded down rather than with the 2 it was rounded up. If instead of breakdown regiments, this division is taking actual step losses, then with 1 step loss, you get 6.5 and 13 because the division is halved in attack and fine in defense. In the proportional, you're at 9s because it's 8.6666 rounded. And in the house rule, you get exactly the same. And if you've got 2 step losses and the division only has 1 remaining cadre, then in the rules as written, you're down to 6.5. Both are halved. In the proportional, you're down to 4.333, rounded down. And in the house rule, you're at 3.25 because attack is now quartered. The raw, I think, gives you the most powerful numbers, ignoring the brittleness of the attack. The proportional, oddly enough, gives you the most even. And the house rule gives you the highest and the lowest. This magical defense is one abuse. The second abuse is the 1-step division abuse. So either you are at so many step losses or you've sent out breakdown regiments. You now have a division that is worth half of the attack under the rules as written. And because it's only 1 step, it only costs 1 T to launch that attack. If you're a German and you have some of these lovely 4-step 24-4 divisions, then you can create a 1-step division with 10 strength for 1 T, which is quite pokey. There's a variation of this, which is that if you have a 4-step division, you can spin off 3 breakdown regiments, send them off to 3 divisions, which have each had a step loss, recombine them to beef them back up to being full strength, and still have a 1-step 10 division for 1 T as well, which is nice, but gamey. And then finally, Your opponent can also be gamey about the rules as written, which is they can go round barrage hunting for full strength division, because all they have to do is knock off a step and boom, that division is halved in attack. So yeah, any opponent worth their salt is going to go down your line and as quickly as possible cause one step loss. The proportional system, I think, avoids that as far as possible. Okay, that's enough on that. Next little side note I want to do is on combat surprise. Now, there is this untwisted OCS CRT in the OCS Depot website. If you like your numbers, knock yourself out. It's just full of them. But this is a little bit of a simplification. In this first diagonal column, we have the net action rating going from -3 to +4. In the rusty red, we have the chance of defender surprise from 72% chance to 0% chance. In the black, we have the chance of attacker surprise, which oddly enough is the reverse from 0 to 72. And in the grey, we have the chance of no surprise at all. The thing to note here is whatever surprise you're able to get, if you're able to do the same attack in Overrun, you would have had the result of the next level up. Say you can do a +1 action rating combat, you're on a 28% chance of attacker surprise in combat, but in an Overrun, that would have jumped up to a 42% chance of surprise, because Overrun surprise has more numbers that create the surprise. I'm sure there's a more technical way of saying that. If you want to see it as a graph, here is the defender surprise going down gently, and here is the attacker surprise going up gently. And this grey is the chance of no surprise. You'll notice the significant dip at the ends, a very small one in the middle. Finally, in little side notes, I just wanted to review all of the things that impact on combat. So first of all, there's the mode you're in, which can impact the combat strength and the action rating. Disorganized being a classic example. There is the action rating of the unit, which gets contributed to both the combat result and to surprise. There's having surprise, which obviously can shift the column on the CTR. There's the terrain that you are seeking to attack, which may impact your combat strength, and indeed may prohibit some units from attacking. There's also the terrain hex side, which will do the same, possibly more punishing. There is the terrain category, that's the hex the defender is going to defend on, which will give you the row of open, close, very close, etc. There is the supply situation, both combat supply, which if you don't feed your defenders will be halved, but also trace supply. Now, trace supply, you do have internals and such like to give you a grace period, possibly even eating off the map in some form, depending on game-specific rules. There's anti-tank effects, which will impact your combat strength in the open. And finally, there's hedgehogs, whose presence will impact surprise and whose level will impact the combat results table, and also give you anti-tank effects. There may be other sorts of field works for game-specific rules. So that's all you have to think about. To try and make that, I don't know, something you can get your mind around more simply, I've tried to come up with a decision tree for you. First of all, do you want to even do an attack? Does it look like it's going to be favourable? How's your supply situation? What are the chances of odds, taking into account the fog of war? Do you have any kind of deception plan to make that fog even foggier? What's the air situation looking like? How's the weather and terrain in this area? Does it favour an attack? Do you have enough reserves, or are you confident in generating exploitation results in order to attack again in the exploitation phase? Is this just the best thing you can do at this point in this place? And if the answer is no, well, go have a better idea. But if the answer is yes, then you'll need to consider whether you are going to reinforce this attack. And as described, are you going to reinforce it for quality with the action rating, in combat strength, or in both? And decided that, are you going to attempt to disorganize the defending hex using your air power in the movement phase? So, which could be a hip shot or could be in the barrage segment. How's the flak looking? Are there things like headquarters and patrol zones and airbase that make the flak worse? Are you liable to be intercepted? And if you are you liable to be defeated? Would the air attack give away where you're going to do your attack to your opponent? Because your opponent has to decide, are they going to reinforce the defending hex, particularly if it's already been disorganized? And they themselves can decide, are they going to try and disorganize the attacking hexes, either using hip shots or air or artillery barrages? Then you have the artillery part where you think, well, am I going to use my artillery to generate a surprise attack somewhere else? Am I using it as a backup just in case my air power fails? And then you have to decide, is it all looking good? Has all the air power and the artillery and the reinforcements created a new situation? Does the attack still look favorable? And if not, well, go and have a better idea. And if it is, go put your dice where your mouth is and may all your rolls be boxcars. Finally, regular combat and overrun are both forms of attack. They are similar-ish. They certainly use the same 9-point procedure, but there are a number of really important differences. So first of all, the phase in which they can take place is different. Overruns can take place in the movement and reaction and exploitation phase. Regular combat can only take place in the combat phase and the exploitation phase. And for clarity, overruns take place in the movement segment of exploitation and combat in the combat segment of exploitation. Next, you can attack from multiple hexes if you are doing regular combat, but you can't for overruns. You can attack with multiple units from one hex, or you can attack with multiple units from many hexes. And you can attack the same hex repeatedly with an overrun if it has movement points remaining, or if it's expended all its movement points, and then you have another overrun unit that wants to have a second go. Regular combat is a one-time deal. Next, your chance of getting attacker surprise only needs a 2 DRM, plus 2 DRM to do an overrun. It needs a plus 3 DRM in regular combat. Likewise, to get defender surprise, 50% chance, you need a -1 in an overrun. You need a -2 in regular combat. It's all a bit harder for surprise in regular combat. The results differ in that you can't get an exploitation result in an overrun, but you can in a regular combat. Advance after combat is mandatory in an overrun. It's optional in a regular combat, although admittedly, 99% of the times you will take it. Free movement, who doesn't love that? You can continue moving and indeed overrunning after an overrun, whereas there is no extra movement in regular combat. Ignoring advance after combat isn't a type of movement. And the movement itself, to do an overrun, the movement cost for the hex, plus the hex side, plus any interdiction needs to be 3 movement points or less for an overrun. It is not applicable for a regular combat. Roads and bridges do not allow attacks through prohibited terrain in overruns, but they do in regular combat. And that makes overruns much harder in things like mountainous terrain and things like that. Aber, you can't move from A to B if you can't move from B to A, is the same in both. And overruns will mainly require refueling because high mobility units are the favorite. Yes, you can overrun with an infantry unit. In regular combat, they don't have to be fueled. And that's it. I mean, how hard can any of that be? I would very much like to thank Chip Saltman, the OCS honcho, and my friend John Clifford, sometime rules editor, and my new friend Heinrich Hoff for their intense expertise in reviewing, well, actually correcting various versions of this video in my attempt to get it right. But obviously, one of my superpowers is to let my mouth run away with me, and any mistakes are mine, but hopefully once identified will be corrected in the comments pinned to this video. So I hope you found that helpful. Thanks for watching. This presentation will be linked also in that pinned comment, and I hope to see you next time. Bye for now.